Hello and welcome to Indian Standard Time. I'm Siddharth Varadarajan. One of the important elements of the Modi government's foreign policy has been its focus on Asia. Asia is India's natural strategic homeland. Even before India became independent in 1946, there was the Asia Relations Conference that was held in Delhi. But over the years, Asia somehow declined in the Indian worldview. Previous governments have tried to change that with the Look East policy, and Prime Minister Modi has tried to ramp it up further by talking in terms of acting East. Joining me today to discuss the Asian security environment, its fault lines, and the potential role, the future role that India can play is Ambassador Chung Min Lee, who is a very important scholar and diplomat from South Korea, currently the Ambassador for National Security Affairs of South Korea, and of course author of a new book coming out this year, Asia's Strategic Fault Lines. Dr. Lee, welcome to the program.
It's a real pleasure to be in your program and the guest in front of such a great audience.
Thank you so much. Dr. Lee, you gave a public address recently in Delhi, the Observer Research Foundation, on Asia's strategic fault lines, discussing some of your ideas. And the question at the center of, or the way you presented it, was all this talk of the current century being Asia's century. You feel somewhere down the line that this is an over-optimistic portrayal, that Asia has many miles to go before this century can truly be called an Asian century. Could you elaborate on why you feel that?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think as an Indian, as a Korean, as Asians, we must be rightfully proud of the achievements we've made politically and economically. But if you look at the next 30, 40 years, Asia faces humongous, unparalleled challenges. There are great power rivalries. China is becoming a very, very important power and player in the Indian Ocean, as she wasn't before. You have some of the world's greatest failed states are in this region. You have deep pockets of poverty and demographic deficits. You have political problems. If you add all that up, it means unless Asia is able to come to terms with those problems, the so-called Asian century, number one, is not automatic, and number two, it will not be able to govern by itself.
And 5 nuclear powers, if you count Israel and North Korea.
That's right. So you have not only the Indian-Pakistani rivalry here in the subcontinent, which is crucial. You also have North Korea, which is on the verge of miniaturizing nuclear warheads as we speak. And she also has long-range missiles that can threaten South Korea, Japan, and even the US very shortly. You have a number of deep geopolitical hotspots, Taiwan Straits, Kashmir, and the list goes on. So obviously, it's not just a nuclear problem, it's a combination of all these problems.
I want to go through each of these fault lines one by one so we can get a sense of your thinking, perhaps the thinking of the South Korean government on this and South Korean analysts. Let's start with China, which is clearly Asia's largest power, its most important power, in many ways a power that arouses the greatest amount of anxiety.
That's right. Yes.
Certainly, there's a great deal of, I think, uncertainty about the direction in which China wants to go. We've seen over the last 3 or 4 years somewhat of a shift in Chinese policy, which I would describe in the following way, that we've seen an accentuation of their territorial disputes with half a dozen Asian neighbors.
That's right, yes.
Simultaneously. It's almost as if the Chinese side is spoiling for a fight or spoiling for, is trying to muddy the waters. What explains this? I mean, the simultaneous accentuation of territorial disputes with Japan, with the ASEAN countries over the South China Sea, with India, even with the ROK, if you take Socotra Rock issue. Right.
Well, that's a very good question because, number one, if you look at China's defense spending over the last 15 years, it shows you that the PLA is on their great leap forward. And their big goal is to make sure that in the next 20, 30 years, China will have enough military capability to maintain not only stability in this region, but in my view, have veto power over any other power that wants to come into the region. And if you look at that region, then obviously you have to increase your maritime presence. And by increasing your maritime presence, you will run into these territorial disputes with the Japanese over the Senkakus, with the Koreans, with and the list goes on. And I think China now realizes that she's at a historical moment where she can show off its military power, because that has been her whole design. Over the last 15 years, as Deng Xiaoping said, hide your true goals until China is growing economically But I think the leadership believes very strongly that China is now strong enough, capable enough, and now it's time to show the world who we really are.
Paradoxically, this Chinese approach of sharpening its differences with its neighbors is accomplishing the one thing that the Chinese say they steadfastly oppose, which is this idea of encircling China. I mean, we've seen how Japan, South Korea, India, Vietnam, countries that have now renewed anxieties over what China is trying to do, have felt the need to reach out to each other. Weren't the Chinese aware that this is going to be one of the consequences of their actions?
That is such a great question, because if you look at the fact that China shares borders with 14 countries, and the good thing about Chinese foreign policy, not one of those countries is an adversary of China. But the limitations of Chinese foreign policy, not one of those countries are a natural friend. And so from that perspective, China really needs...
How would you define a natural friend?
For example, if India is in trouble, who will you call? You have many friends around the world, right? If you ask China, who's your best friend? Well, maybe Russia, maybe Pakistan, maybe North Korea. Well, those are all assets from their perspective, but they're also liabilities from the broader world. But going back to your central question, in 2010, for example, the North Koreans destroyed one of our naval corvettes. 46 sailors died. In December of that year, for the first time, the North Koreans bombed one of our islands. And the Chinese perspective at that time was basically, look, this happened, we don't really know why, but we're keeping a neutral stance. At the same time, when the US and the Koreans reacted with their own exercises, the Chinese got very upset. As a result, the Korean perception of China has changed. Japanese perceptions have changed. Indian views have changed. What has happened? All the other major countries surrounding China throughout the Asian littorals are now realizing you have to really band together, not to contain China, that's impossible. But we should at least tell the Chinese, you're not the only one in the bloc.
Would you include middle powers like Indonesia or Malaysia?
Absolutely. Especially Vietnam and Indonesia. If you look at ASEAN, if you look at the opinion polls, every single major Southeast Asian country is feeling anxious over China. At the same time, every single American ally trades more with China than with the US.
Right.
So China has leverage much more than the former Soviet Union, but the key issue is politically, all Asian countries are feeling that pressure from China.
I'd like to drill deeper on the Korean Peninsula issue, the North Korea, DPRK, and specifically Chinese attitudes towards North Korea. China, it is said, has played a somewhat constructive role in the six-party talks with the North Koreans. Some analysts credit Beijing with being able to restrain Pyongyang to a certain extent. At the same time, there is a perception that the Chinese side is perhaps running with the hare, hunting with the hounds.
That's right.
How would you assess, as a South Korean official, where China stands? Do you think the Chinese have leverage that they don't use with the Kim Jong-un government, or are they as helpless in many ways as other big powers?
I think that really depends on the issue that we're talking about. The fact that China is the DPRK's largest provider of economic assistance, we all know. And so she provides energy and food to North Korea and is a vital pipeline for North Korea's entry into the global system. Having said that, I think the Chinese realize that over the longer term, North Korea is more of a liability than an asset. And why is that? Well, for example, if you look at the future of the Korean Peninsula, it's not with North Korea, but South Korea. South Korea's trade with China is over $300 billion. We have just signed an FTA with the Chinese. More Chinese come to South Korea as tourists than ever before. 70,000 Koreans study in China every single year. 70,000. So that number of interaction just goes beyond whatever the North Koreans have with the Chinese. But the key issue is political. They believe they owe North Korea allegiance and loyalty because of their history, and we understand that. But over the longer term, once you want to reunify the Korean Peninsula, the key is, who do you want to see in charge of the Korean Peninsula? A South Korea that is friendlier towards China, or a North Korea that controls the peninsula? And I think the answer is quite clear.
Well, on the assumption that any reunified Korea would be essentially an extension of South Korea, or ROK, would you say that the Chinese and the Japanese both share apprehensions about Korean reunification, even if it occurs, as we would all imagine and hope, in the benign form that the extension of ROK would take?
That's a very good question. I think officially all governments in the six-party talks support a unified Korea without foreign intervention. And we believe that at some point in time, hopefully unification will occur without any bloodshed in a peaceful way, and it'll be, as you said, an extension of South Korea. And what do the Chinese want out of this, or the Japanese? Number one, a Korean peninsula that is free of nuclear weapons. The moment the Korean peninsula has nuclear weapons, the moment it will be targeted by the Chinese, Russians, and other powers. We cannot compete with them. So for our security, we do not want nuclear weapons, period.
Right.
Let's make it very clear. Number two, no weapons that are strategic offensive systems, so that it will basically be a threat to the regional powers. So you will have a very strong, robust defensive army, but not really longer-term strategic capabilities. Number three, the foreign policy must be a little bit more balanced. Obviously, we are very close with the Americans now. I see no change in that policy happening at all. But over the longer term, once Korea is unified, we will have closer ties with the Chinese. It's just a matter of
Would there
time.
be any rationale? I mean, I know we're sort of crystal gazing here, stargazing, but
right.
Would there be any rationale to have American military presence in ROK once Korea is reunified?
That's something that I think the leadership at that point will have to decide. And I think if you look at the ground force structure, the fact that you have 28,000 troops in South Korea today in defense, a common defense against North Korea, once Korea is unified under our auspices, I think the rationale for maintaining ground troops will be a lot lower than it is today. But at that point, they will figure out exactly what type of an arrangement we will have with our American allies, and also what type of a security platform we'll have with the Chinese.
Ambassador Lee, let's turn to Japan now. One of the factors which have, in a way, muddied the waters, apart from uncertainty about China, is the outlook and orientation of the Shinzo Abe government. Right. I know that the South Korean government shares the apprehension of many Asian countries, including China, about for example, the reinterpretation of the Japanese constitution, I think Article 9 that the Abe government has done.
That's right.
What's your sense of where this greater nationalism in Japan is going to take Tokyo?
You know, I want to share this view with your Indian viewers all over India, and of course outside India as well. World War II ended 70 years ago, but did real peace come to Asia? I think not really. And the reason is because I think the Japanese, as much as they are a democracy and a contributor to the UN system, have not really understood deep inside the pain they've inflicted on many Asian states. So the issue of the sexual slavery, these are grandmothers in their late 80s, early 90s, some 50 of them who are still alive. The fact that you had slave laborers working in Japanese camps. And so the fact that you had medical experiments on live human beings, including American prisoners of war. These are atrocious, basically acts against humanity. And so what we are really saying is, look, we don't want the Japanese to say, okay, we accept responsibility and let's go on. We want you to tell us it is time to really lay the path so that all of us can work together to build a common Asia. But every single time Mr. Abe comes out with a statement, he says, look, we realize we made mistakes in the war, but at the same time we have to honor the dead in the Japanese war machine. And he has watered down all these resolutions so that from our perspective, and China's, for example, the Japanese are not really sincere in their apologies.
I completely agree with you, but let me play devil's advocate for a minute. Are we talking about history because that history still is a driving force for current day Japanese policy? Clearly not. I mean, Japan today isn't a militarist power.
No, of course not.
So while, and this is what the Japanese might say, that while judgments on what happened in the past have their place and are important, you had the Tokyo war trials,
that's right,
which passed judgment on the Japanese regime at the time and assigned blame to individuals, Japanese individuals. So even if Japan and South Korea, or Japan and China disagree about questions of history, are they really that important? For example, would that be? It's clearly not a determinant of Japanese policy today. Or do you think that there are elements of continuity in Japanese policy?
I think Japan is a democracy. I think Mr. Abe, although he wants a so-called normal country, a Japan that is normal in military and security aspects, I think everybody realizes that Japan has legitimate security concerns, especially with the rise of China and the fact that they take North Korea's threats also very, very seriously. Right. But my whole point is this. If you want a strong Japan militarily and security-wise, what do you need? you need the acquiescence and support and understanding of your Asian neighbors. And the only way you will get that is by coming clean on history. So for Japan's longer-term strategic interests, I tell them, come clean on history. That way Asians will say Japan has legitimate interests. And from the U.S. perspective, as the New York Times editorialized just yesterday, Mr. Abe must show the world she is able to work with the legacies of history. That way the U.S. will have a great partner in Asia.
So let me put it this way. If Japan were to embrace, or if the Abe government were to embrace the kind of understanding of history that the rest of us in Asia...
Or especially Merkel's Germany, for example, has.
Right, exactly. And were to, in a way, make a clean break with the past.
That's right.
South Korea would be more comfortable with Japan playing an expanded military and strategic role in Asia?
I think there will still be reservations, to be quite honest.
So your reservations over the reinterpretation of the Japanese constitution would still remain, right?
Yes. Yeah. However, I think if the Japanese were able to reconcile history with us and with the Chinese, but especially with us, I think the Korean perspective will be, okay, let's begin to talk. What areas can we cooperate on mutual security concerns? For example, beginning of this year, we signed a trilateral intelligence information sharing agreement on the North Korean threat between the U.S., Japan, and Korea. So that was one small but very important step forward. So there are areas where we will cooperate. And as I said, on humanitarian assistance, on UNPKO operations, on regional stability, on SNR missions, there are roles the SDF can play. And we understand that. But that type of assurance will come and will be much greater if we are able to walk a common path on history.
Let's look at South Korea-China relations a bit more deeply. I know that Seoul protested the declaration of the ADIZ.
That's right, yes.
The Air Defense Identification Zone by the Chinese, I think in 2010.
Yes.
That zone...
2013.
2030, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That zone essentially covered or overlapped with areas that South Korea includes as part of its territorial seas, as it were, or exclusive economic zone, specifically the so-called Socotra Rock. I know you protested at the time.
Yes.
But both sides have been careful, both President Park and President Xi have been careful to not allow this to escalate.
That's right.
How important is the territorial question with China? Clearly, it doesn't have the same salience as Japan.
No, because I think the Chinese realize that they have territorial disputes, as we said earlier, with almost every major Asian country, and Korea is just one of them. From as far as we are concerned, we have this little place called Iodo, which is the southern tip of the...
which is a semi-submerged rock,
that's right, yes.
Essentially. Yeah.
And we feel that is, of course, our ROK territory. And so we discussed those issues with the Chinese, but for the time being, there really is no hot dispute between China and Korea on the particular issue. We have both agreed to disagree. The Chinese have laid down their views, we have laid out our views, but there are other interests that are much more important. The other major issue that we have had contention with is the so-called Western Sea. And there, the demarcation line is with the North Koreans, but there's also a fisheries problem with the Chinese.
Okay.
Every single year, especially in the crab fishing season, there are hundreds and hundreds of Chinese ships who comes into our waters, and then so that has run into huge problems. That is one major issue that we want to resolve with our Chinese friends. But overall, the territorial dispute between Korea and China is, number one, very manageable, and number two, it is much less important than other outstanding issues, i.e., for example, North Korea's nuclear weapons.
Ambassador, India lies at the western end of East Asia. We, both under previous governments and, as I said, under Prime Minister Modi, have become more active in the East Asian space or Asian space. India is an active member of, for example, the East Asian Summit process, and we've been holding maritime or naval exercises with Japan, with the US and Australia, even with the PRC, even with the Chinese.
That's right.
How do you see India's emerging role in East Asia and the so-called Indo-Pacific region?
I can only say three words: positive, more positive, and most positive. And the reason is very, very simple. India, for a long time, from Korea's perspective, was a very distant power for a number of reasons. So the tyranny of geography defined our relationship. But from the 90s onwards, there's been growing economic contact. We've had more political contact. Your defense minister has visited Korea. Our defense minister has had dialogues with you. And my president has visited India. And very soon, the Prime Minister Modi will go to Korea. This is part of Mr. Modi's so-called Look East Policy 3.0. And we believe very strongly that we have a very, very good story to tell with our Indian friends. What's that story? The key issue here in India now is make in India. And we have shown the world what make in Korea means. And we are both IT powers, we're both democracies, we have shared values, and there's a huge complementarity between our peoples and countries. So India, from Korea's perspective, is a very, very critical friend and a partner. Why? For the first time in Asian history, China, India, and Japan are all rising at the same time. And India is the only country of those three powers that we have no historical baggage with, none whatsoever. So in that sense, India is a very natural partner and a very natural friend.
As India moves to cement its relations with Japan, with Australia, with
Yes.
South Korea,
With ASEAN countries.
with ASEAN countries, and with the US. I mean, we saw during President Obama's visit
That's right.
to India in January this very important document on the strategic vision for the Asia-Pacific region
Yes.
issued. How do we ensure that the Chinese don't, in a sense, overreact to this and do things which may be unpredictable or
Well, I think,
unhelpful?
we have to tell the Chinese this is not so-called an anti-China coalition.
I mean, and they would be quick to label this as containment or encirclement.
But that really depends on China's choices. And I think this is what we have to tell our Chinese friends. China is now so powerful that whatever choice she makes resonates not only in the region but in the world. So Chinese choices, by extension, has world implications, which will mean that China and other powers must react. That's only natural, isn't it? China reacts to what the US and the Russians do. Why doesn't she expect India and Japan to react to Chinese actions? So first of all, that's number one. Number two, we have shared values. India, Japan, Korea, Australia, Indonesia are all democracies. And that is a very powerful voice which China will never have unless she democratizes. So democracies have very different values. And that's something that I think China has to understand. We want to be friends with India not because we want to use India as leverage against the Chinese,
Right.
but because of intrinsic interest between Seoul and Delhi. That is something that our Chinese friends must understand. Why? We feel much more comfortable, that's the key issue, with India than with, for example, the PRC.
Are you optimistic about incipient efforts to create Asian architecture like the EAS? Are you confident that this process will go further, reach a logical conclusion? I mean, Asia is the only continent to lack any kind of pan-continental architecture.
Right.
Do you think that's likely, or will the existing fault lines act as a barrier to that?
Asia has many so-called alphabet soups, right? We have EAS,
Right.
we have APEC.
But they're all sub-regional.
That's right. And I think ASEAN, by the end of this year, hopes to create an ASEAN community. And I think ASEAN has made tremendous progress. But will ASEAN be able to resolve these hardcore security problems? And the answer is not really. It's not designed for that. So in Asia, you have, unlike any other region, very strong, state-centric, very powerful states. India, Japan, even Korea, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar, the list goes on.
Right.
So these states have very strong national identities that will, I think, for the time being, tamper any road towards some kind of Asian union. But having said that, Asia does have lots of tracks, lots of networks, so I don't think you need to superimpose an Asian house to make sure that Asia cooperates.
Right, okay. But whether Asia builds this architecture now or in the immediate future, it's clear, Master Lee, that stronger bilateral ties and a stronger effort to resolve these bilateral, or in some cases multilateral fault lines, hold the key to Asia, in a sense, realizing this dream of a nation.
Absolutely right. You mentioned the Indo-Pacific, for instance. A couple of years ago, in the Australian Defence White Paper, for the first time, they emphasized the Indo-Pacific.
Right.
What does this mean? It means that the Indian Ocean is merging with the Western Pacific. And who lies at the middle of this? India.
Right.
So from India's perspective, security and stability in the Indo-Pacific now is not just an Indian concern. It's a concern to Koreans and Japanese, even Taiwanese and others. Why? Every drop of oil that comes in the Middle East traverses this particular waterway all the way to the Strait of Malacca and up to Korea and Japan. So in that sense, Indian ocean security is crucial to our well-being. And how else can you explain this? So this is why we are very positive about India's very robust role in this region as a major naval and maritime power. And we hope that we will continue maritime cooperation with India.
Ambassador Lee, on that note, we will have to end it, I'm afraid. Thank you so much for joining us on Rajya Sabha TV.
Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful experience.
Thank you. And this brings us to the end of this episode of Indian Standard Time. Do join us next week, another guest, another program. Thank you.